Hi, everyone. It's John again with Dan Edmonds, and this week we
Hello.
are back with Halloween. Michael Myers, his name is just as much connected to Halloween as horror, and so more than 40 years he has terrorized both the box office around the world as well as your screen at home these days. So we'll look at the stories behind the man, myth, and legend. Um, yeah, so before we kind of dive into the main part of the discussion, yeah, maybe I guess one things we can talk about are like some which versions that we choose to watch ourselves, and then kind of like let's call it that. All I think will give some sense of like where we're coming from.
Yeah, so I watched the 1978 version, the original, of course,
Of course.
and the most recent 2018 reboot. I did want to watch more, but I kind of ran out of time. But yeah,
And I did manage to watch quite a few actually, including the Rob Zombie versions.
right.
Because I'd seen so many of these before. Um, the couple that I were new to me, like kind of was the 2018 version, of course, and then the HBO, version, which I didn't realize it had the kind of Dawson's Creek roots, and we'll kind of talk more about that. That's kind of a interesting connection and everything. Um, and as always, like kind of besides like talking about the ideas behind these series, franchises, and stuff like that, we'll definitely go into discussions about what's the point, why do these? Certainly, Hollywood's going to be doing them as much as people buy tickets and stuff, and I think that's one of the things that maybe it's like a one kind of entry point for us into the discussion. After John Carpenter's success with Halloween and stuff, the original 1978, certainly we saw like kind of this golden era of horror movies in the 80s. I mean, you had like so many knockoffs, and um, one of the discussions that Cisco Ebert kind of had, it was an episode they particularly kind of got into, like what's behind like kind of this rise, and they basically were saying that like all these slasher films really like kind of were not only distracting but also like kind of just they were just violent without real reason, stuff like that. And my idea about it was that they were making these because people were buying tickets. I mean, that's one of the
Mm.
basic things about Hollywood. That as long as people are going out to see them and stuff, um, it's going to keep the producers kind of wanting to finance it, and it's going to keep, kind of people wanting to kind of crank them out and stuff.
Yeah, I mean the 80s definitely was like the golden era of slasher movies. There's no doubt about it. And I mean, I think at the time there was quite a lot of they were seen as like the most risky things to go and watch. It was like you'd sort of brag to your friends, oh, have you seen Nightmare on Elm Street and things like that. And there was kind of it was still horror was being pretty inventive and finding new ways of producing the scares, which kind of by the 90s I think everyone was kind of a bit over it really, and I mean sort of veered off into torture porn, or they tried to sort of reinvent or there was the Scream movies obviously that kind of um, took a fourth wall approach and just reinvented the genre quite cleverly, I thought.
I
But
think
it took
one I think one big influence, and I think we talked about it with the Night of the Living Dead, was like basically having the ability to start watching things at home really changed the
mm,
dynamics of kind of the movie going experience. Because I think I can't really remember for sure, but I believe that I watched Halloween the first time on VHS because it was not something that like we were allowed to or could go and watch and stuff because my parents weren't didn't have any interest in taking us to movie theaters to see something like that, but
yeah.
we managed to somehow persuade them to like kind of slide in that that Halloween tape along with the other tapes we got for that week and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think I watched it on TV for the first time, which wasn't the
Okay,
best. Which wasn't the best because you have advert breaks and everything else, so it's kind
yeah,
of ruins it a bit. But yeah, that was definitely the first time I watched it.
I think that really just overall changed how like before like it was a bigger deal for kids especially to get into the theater like kind of because of the R rating and stuff like that. But
Mm,
now all of a sudden you had the access, just it was easier to kind of con your parents into like getting that slasher film into the weekly download, I guess, if you if you will, stuff like that.
Well, I think there was a certain appeal as well to going and seeing sort of rated R movies back then, and
Mm.
they actually made a decent amount of money. Now they tend to tone them down so they can get a
Right.
bigger audience, which wasn't the case back then. You could get a big audience for an R-rated movie, which
That's
is why a
true.
lot of the action movies and various other things in the 80s are pretty violent because
Mm.
you could get the audience.
Definitely. I think the other thing too is that like I feel that horror really tapped into something in the psyche too that was also part of the 80s where we had this sense of like kind of at any time there was the nightmare of nuclear destruction and just total annihilation stuff like that. And certainly you had the movies like War Games that actually direct more directly with the theme and stuff. But I think horror as a whole is a way to kind of like for us to feel that kind of terror and that fear and to like have some control over that feeling, like kind of because you can just always pause, you can always stop the video and stuff like that. You can go buy a ticket or not buy a ticket and everything. But meanwhile there's this sense of like something over the horizon that any time could just be launched on top of us and stuff like that. And that sense of dread, that fear, is something that like you had no control over. So that was like something that like um, I don't know. I feel like that's one of the things that horror addressed was like the ability to kind of have some kind of control over that fear.
Mm. Well, I think as well that's the real genius of Halloween, because this is the concept where you've got a day where people can dress up as masked killers
Mm-hmm.
and they can do, you could get away with
Mm-hmm.
being it there. That's and if you actually look at the way the film's structured, almost every scene is something he's taken something fairly mundane in
Mm-hmm.
everyday life and he's just sort of made it creepy by sort of sticking Michael Myers in the background, or he's like kind of, you get, and it's this kind of thing where you're just maybe slightly your attention is away from your everyday life and you look out the corner of your eye
Mm-hmm.
and there's Michael Myers in your back
Yeah.
garden or outside of. So I mean, if you actually look at I think I watched one of those movie sins videos about Halloween, and yeah, I mean Michael Myers does seem to magically transport himself around the town pretty quickly, but I think that's the thing though. Every scene is almost constructed to make you kind of slightly creeped out about everyday life. Like the windows. He's obviously got the curtains blowing in the wind to
Mm-hmm.
make you obvious that the window's open, and so don't leave
Right.
your windows open. You stare out the window at someone too long. You call out to people in the car. Who's that behind the hedge? It's like every single scene, and there's also this underlying thing of you can't really trust the authorities to do the
Mm-hmm.
required job.
Yeah.
So I think those were all the things that really kind of got under people's skin with that movie, which made it so effective.
Yeah. And that's the thing about like kind of, horror done well is just like you kind of pointed out, you know, very subtly kind of, teasing us with the different fears that we have, right? Like
Mm,
certainly like kind of one of the classics is the shower scene from Psycho. And certainly, John Carpenter talks about drawing from that. And when you do that, like kind of it's really like it just taps into that fear that we have that we either sometimes ignore or turn off and everything. But then on the screen we can't but ignore it because it's right there. And I think that is part of the brilliance of it. What's funny though is that horror tends to be also looked on, and I think part of it is the slasher genre where there's a lot of low budget kind of like really poorly done ones. But of course, John Carpenter with a low budget achieved a lot, like you said. And so it's funny how when he took things back to his alma mater, like USC, something we talked about before, starting and stuff, is then like he was basically ridiculed and like kind of there was somebody who even like kind of yelled at him like oh what are you doing making this kind of garbage and stuff like that,
mm,
and I think he really showed that like like even with the low budget you can do something that kind of really like is done you know tastefully and well, that like it's not only kind of taps into her fears and stuff, but also just it's cinematically well done. I think
yeah.
because you kind of see like kind of all the little techniques that he does, like as you pointed out, and it's just you just get a sense that there's a craft there. It's not just
Oh,
cheap
totally.
jump scares and stuff, which
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of like what we've gone more towards like like movies that like where they may even have like great cinematography, but then the reliance is on just jump scares and just stuff that like kind of it's like okay like here's another jump scare, that kind of feeling.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think most of what makes Halloween so effective is the fact that probably down to Deborah Hill, who wrote it,
Mm.
the actual premise is quite clever, and it really just plays on people's vulnerabilities.
Mm.
And I think, I'm not sure how I mean, I have a feeling that obviously Halloween was integral in, kicking off the slasher genre. But I mean, I think the reason, I'm guessing the reason, say, the sister is semi-naked or mostly naked in the first scene, is actually to play on this idea of vulnerability rather than pure exploitation. Well, maybe I'm giving too much credit, I don't know. But I mean, it's there, and the fact that Jamie Lee Curtis's character isn't necessarily phased by Michael Myers immediately. Because I mean, if you're coming into this, because you have a frame of watching a horror movie and just thinking like, how can they be so stupid? But the idea is it's Halloween, and it could just be some guy in a Halloween costume. So she's obviously quite intelligent and quite confident enough not to be phased by him, which doesn't necessarily. You could also interpret that like she's being a bit dumb, but I don't think that was the intention.
Definitely.
And it's only really after, while she's seen him a few times, she really starts to feel like, oh, there's a problem here, which is quite well, which is really, you've got to give a credit to both Deborah Hill and Jamie Lee for portraying that, I think.
Yeah, I feel like, why, like, that's done over and over again is the feeling of like kind of, that we're putting ourselves somewhat in Jamie Lee Curtis's shoes, her character's shoes, where, like different times we walk along each day, we see stuff and we kind of go, oh, that's nothing and everything. And I think they want to kind of embed that in us. Is that feeling like kind of how, how often do you kind of like ignore something and then meanwhile the danger is real, right? Kind of, I think it's that kind of, subliminal kind of message, I guess, and stuff. And then certainly like part of what makes that work also is the music, like kind of where we're having like kind of this tension music and stuff, and then this guy like kind of like the music is such an integral part about it that like part of it was like I guess before the final cut there was the cut without music and it just like kind of just didn't work and everything, and you can kind of see that like
I read that as well.
Yeah, you can just imagine too, like if you watch this without the music it just it doesn't have the same effect, but then just the kind of the combination of the ominous like kind of the piano and then like kind of the I'm not sure what instrument that's used, but it's kind of like it's like kind of the drawn out like almost like a trumpet kind of thing stuff, and it just like now we just associate that with so much with Michael Myers. It's like kind of the one guy did a prank where he shows up in an elevator, he's got the mask on and he's playing the music and people were freaked out. Just so it's funny because he doesn't have a knife out or anything like that. He's sitting there with a piano and people are freaked out like so it's that thing where it's interesting how the music and the mask but that combination is like a trigger like and I think that's like kind of indication of like kind of how sometimes just the music different times can tap into our emotions much more quickly than like because again the prankster didn't have a knife or anything like that. There's no blood even and everything.
Yeah. Well, I think that I mean, I'm a massive fan of John Carpenter movies, and I just think I love the fact that he writes his own themes for his music, and it gives them such a such a great feeling, so all encompassing, I think, and he's a genius on the synth, John Carpenter. I want to listen. I didn't realize there were albums of his themes for movies that never got made. So I really have to go and check those out. But for 3 days on a synthesizer, he did pretty, seminal theme there for a movie.
And I think what's also interesting is, the music, in particular, the Mr. Sandman song, right, where he does it to kind of flip things, turn things on the head. Where I feel like the times that he chooses to use that is that like whenever we hear that song, right, we think of this kind of time of the 50s where things were like simpler and like kind of more naive in some ways. And I feel like that's like kind of his little jab, if you will, at that idea though. At different times we're kind of like, like kidding ourselves and stuff like that. And I think it's like a subliminal kind of little message that kind of is by using that song and everything.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the main thing with a lot of 80s horror movies, definitely. It's like, you know, the excessive lifestyle, you're going to get drunk or go and have sex or smoke a joint. Yeah, that's when you're being naive and danger's going to get you, you know.
So one of the other kind of key things, of course, is the idea of like psychopathy, or what is it that kind of makes a psychopath and stuff like that. Like Dr. Loomis, like kind of certainly he almost just gives the textbook definition of something that has no remorse, something that has no feeling, or empathy and stuff like that. And so we kind of had some of that with Psycho, but we never really got as much as to what that's about and everything. But here, what really makes Halloween stand out is the fact that, like, the very beginning, right, is a kid who kills his sister and everything like that. Like, that's horror in the sense of, like, it wasn't like until we had the mask reveal, we thought it was like some stranger and all that kind of stuff. But that very first intro of the fact that, like, here's this kid doing that. I think that in itself was like kind of just like gave you that like colds kind of running down your back or something like that. That, like,
yeah,
I think that's horror in itself. That, like, it's the idea that, like, oh, it could be anybody and stuff like that.
And it's just a kind of a shame that the sister's actual performance of dying was a bit naff by today's standards. And then the knife is kind of floating around a bit, but yeah, I mean, I think the whole way it starts with the first person view, and it's almost, I mean, it wasn't the first, I read it wasn't the first movie to do that. I think Black Christmas was the first one, which I really want to actually check out as well now. But the fact that you've got this very minimalistic thing and this first person view, it's almost like, just to think one of the most effective video game formats is first person horror, and it's almost like, oh wow, this is quite ahead of its time here. You're feeling but yeah, you're right, the reveal of it being a kid is pretty interesting.
And of course, like, what that tends to bring up with a lot of people is like the idea that, like, oh, these horror movies, like, kind of make kids violent, this and that. And I think it's like I think we've talked about a little bit where it's the same thing with video games that, like, in themselves, like, kind of I really don't buy it that, like, that's going to create the violence and stuff like that, or encourage, like, kind of kids to snap other kids, whatever. I mean, I feel like on the other hand, like, kind of what happens is that, like, like there's some different kind of and psychopathy, like, kind of gets into that a little bit, that it is a genetic trait. It is something that, like, tends to be triggered by kind of environment or anything like that. So I had to admit that, like, if the kid is constantly playing violent video games, watching violent movies and stuff like that, and that's all their world and everything, then and on top of that, like, they're in an abusive home and all, these are all, I think, more factors than anything else. Like, in and of themselves, nothing is going to be the cause, but it just put together, you have things that, like, kind of it's almost like the difference between putting like a plant in a forest versus, like, putting a plant in the desert, right, and stuff. Certainly, one is going where it's going to be thriving, and I feel like that's sometimes with some genetic traits like psychopathy, whatever. Some environments are going to cause it to thrive in its in a negative way and everything, and other things are just not going to be as conducive. So certainly having a healthy home will be, of course, the opposite, and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, definitely they're making the case for genetic psychopathy in Halloween because he's far too young to have really environment to have played that huge effect. Right. And the interesting thing for me, though, is I don't know what your take on this, but is Michael Myers, at least in the first movie anyway, are his murders sexualized? Because it's when he sees his sister, having sex is when he kills her, and then it seems to be most of the other babysitters. I mean, the only one being obviously Laurie, who escapes, but she's not involved in anything. But anyone else is. And I mean, there's all the heavy breathing in the mask. It seems to imply that there's a heavy sort of sexual undertone to a lot of this killing.
And I love how, like, there was some interview that I saw with John Carpenter where he absolutely says that, like, that wasn't the intent and stuff like that.
Mm.
But it's interesting though how all the other what's it called, the Friday the 13th and all the other kind of the other slasher films picked up on it as like kind of like that's even Scream parodies that, right, where they talk about like kind of how like, oh, this always happens in horror movies, like they go after the teens that are kind of being naughty, that kind of idea and stuff. And I feel like that's kind of just in a way what it's become is that like that's become the trope. But in reality, I don't. Yeah, I think that like it was not intentional that way and stuff like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's my feeling anyway. And on the other hand, though, what I think is interesting is sometimes we do things subconsciously that we don't even really like kind of. And certainly art is like one of those things, right, where we do a work of art. Sometimes I feel like sometimes the artist will do something that like is ingrained in them that he's not even really thinking about it that way. That like is like where we may interpret it, or we may kind of a critic or whatever, or just a viewer may say like read into it this way, but that was not what they consciously thought about doing and stuff. So
yeah,
I think there's always that aspect as well.
Yeah, I wonder if also because it's quite an interesting sort of arc for Laurie's character, and that she goes from this sort of oblivious nature to being scared and the victim, but then actually does stick a knitting needle. Sorry, spoilers again, but a knitting needle in Michael's neck, and she does make a pretty good go of defending herself. So it's almost she was actually, I wonder, because that was a year before Alien, and I'm thinking is that was she the inspiration perhaps for the woman taking the power back in some of these.
Yeah, certainly. Like when you it's interesting when you said Alien, that triggers for me and stuff like that is the idea that like if you look at Geiger and his art in there's a very sexualized aspect about it and stuff. And again, like that's another great example of like the artist like kind of having these things come out in his art that like he didn't maybe not like think like, oh, I want to make this more sexy or more sexual, stuff like that, but it just comes out like kind of you can't miss it, like kind of like where a lot of the parts look like genitalia or like kind of a lot of different things. And I feel like the kind of again the subliminal things, stuff like that, is that where one of the things I've read way back when was the idea that like a gun is a weapon of where you tend to keep distance from your victim and stuff like that, whereas a knife is a very sexualized weapon because like you're stabbing into the victim and stuff. And like this again, probably people feminists and all that kind of stuff that really criticize like kind of where women are the victims and stuff like that. And I think that's the thing that like we really can't separate is the fact that like regardless of whether Carpenter intended to have that become this trope and become this kind of tradition, if you will. But I think it's just part of our psyche. It's like something that like it's just as much part of our like kind of our DNA, like kind of whether we're psychotic or not stuff, as it is for conscious kind of parts of us and everything.
Yeah.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Another thing that I found interesting with Halloween is the idea of the anonymous killer, so to speak, in that there were apparently movies before that had killers who you never really knew the name of. But I think what's interesting about Michael Myers is that you know his name, you kind of know where he's been, but his personality is the mystery. It's like you have no idea what really drives this behavior or what caused it or anything else. And it's all kind of like alluded to. And I mean, I did find it kind of funny that, Dr. Loomis calls him the evil. And it's kind of, it doesn't seem very professional, but.
Well, and he's actually in the credits and stuff is called The Shape and everything.
Yeah.
And so I think what that also addresses is how in the 80s there started becoming more awareness of this idea of serial killers, like kind of again psychopaths and stuff. Mindhunter is a great series for that. Like I don't know if you had a chance to watch that.
Yeah, my wife watches it, but I haven't actually watched it much. But
check it out, and you'll see the interesting connection with it, because up to that point, the FBI only really kind of like recognized the idea that like you had either crimes of passion, crimes of greed and stuff like that, and then that was really it. Like kind of to them it was like kind of black and white as to what were the motivations for killing and everything. Then they realized like there were these killings that didn't fit that pattern, and then next thing they know they realized like holy crap, there are these people that like killed in serial. The idea of a serial killer was first came up because they started seeing this pattern. Like like they up to then they didn't really they saw that maybe somebody would go on a spree or this and that, but they still like wrote it off as like that person's just crazy or whatever. But they didn't really kind of identify or study it until like around the late 70s, early 80s and stuff like that. So that was something that like kind of that they started seeing and recognizing like, oh crap, there are like kind of these wolves if you are among us and stuff. And that was like I think another influence was like kind of recognizing that like there is something kind of a new kind of horror, if you will, like kind of on top of like the supernatural was like kind of this and that's the thing about horror. It's like horror is addressing supernatural, and supernatural like we tend to think of it as like warlocks or magic and stuff, but I think here we have something that like is hypernatural, like kind of beyond what's nature and stuff like that, and that was another definition of supernatural that kind of has developed with the Michael Myers story.
The other thing we're talking about that is this. I don't know if it was the first movie to do this, but the idea that the killer comes back after receiving what should normally take a normal person down.
Right.
I mean, over the years, poor old Michael, in some respects, has been shot through the eye and shot several times. God knows how many lethal blows he's had to endure. But
yeah, I think that's another way. It's supernatural, because like he seems on the surface like a human being, just a regular man or like that, but he has these supernatural or superhuman like kind of strength and like kind of his ability to kind of keep coming back and stuff. So that's like kind of and then some one of the things that kind of happened after Halloween 2 and 3 and stuff, and we'll talk about that as well. But they started kind of having more connections to kind of actual the idea of like kind of something more supernatural sense of like witchcraft and this and that, and like kind of, and that was like kind of before the H2O, the 20th anniversary, where they just kind of like basically wiped out all that and like kind of started clean slate and everything.
Yeah, because obviously it's the more realistic, the more scary it is. But in terms of a frame of history for people who maybe weren't there at the time, like you have Marvel superheroes now. I think your slashers were, they were the superheroes of the 80s almost, because they had all these sort of amazing powers and killed people in lots of wild and wacky ways that you wanted to kind of see. I kind of think it's a similar sort of thing in a way.
Definitely.
in terms of the culture. Times were crazy in the 80s. What can I say? But yeah.
One of the things I did want to kind of mention though was so the H2O version, like kind of I thought was like interesting how and I like as we talked about before again during this discussion was that I didn't know the Dawson's Creek connection and stuff. Kevin Williamson apparently did the original script, and one of the things that like that show in itself, I probably was not as interested when it was originally aired because it seemed like some teen show and stuff like that. But I think what made me more interested was down the road recognizing or realizing that like Dawson, the character, had this love of film and television, and that was like his dream was to kind of end up in the business. So he was like kind of like a stand-in for Kevin Williamson, who like the actual writer, producer, and stuff like that. And so you see like kind of in just about the whole series how he constantly like kind of will like his room was like wall to wall with like movie posters like different classics like Jaws, that kind of thing and stuff. And then there's constantly references. He geeks out by watching like kind of these different movies with his friend who like kind of becomes his love interest, Joey, and stuff like that. And you see some of that in the this H2O version, but what happened was apparently that like there were different rewrites, so that a lot of that got wiped out. But then you still had towards the beginning, anyways, where they kept a lot of the original dialogue. There was still kind of like some references like that and stuff. So I thought that was like an interesting kind of connection to the whole series and stuff.
What did you think of H2O?
It wasn't bad. I mean, in itself, like what worked for me with that show, that particular one, was that you had the main elements of Michael Myers and Jamie Lee Curtis. I mean, that's like something that like where in the third one they got away from that, right? Like this kind of bizarre kind of thing, and then they and at that point they had to backtrack and like kind of try to bring some of that back and everything. The other thing that kind of like was just overall like kind of I thought was a little bit out there was like that even though they had the focus on the teens and everything like that, they all kind of like a little bit too MTV and stuff like that. So that's
Right.
like probably like the downside where and again that's definitely where to me like it became like the Dawson's Creek version of the Halloween series and stuff. They were a little bit too slick and a little too glossy and everything like that. They were all attractive because in the first one what worked was like kind of like besides Jamie Lee Curtis, who has this kind of very natural kind of look and very much like kind of you feel like she's like you see her as a neighborhood babysitter and stuff like that. So were her friends. They were people that you felt like like this was very much like the feel of Main Street USA and stuff. And so it was something that like really kind of resonated with people. It was like that feeling that like here was this very plain town where all of these horrible things were happening. And I think that's was another kind of connection to what we started seeing in the 80s as well, was like kind of with the these serial killings and stuff like that, that we started realizing that like like the cities aren't necessarily the places that are dangerous. It's right in our own back door.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I was interested. Did you watch the 2018 version at all?
I did.
Okay. Yeah, my take on the 2018 version, because that was the only one I watched, was it was trying a little bit too hard to be too respectful of the original in a way, in that they used the original font, the original music, or just a slight variation of it, and it followed very similar things, but it was, but I mean, her character is more or less like Sarah Connor, slightly reinvented, really, and
that definitely felt like kind of what they did.
with a bit of sort of millennial chat from the teenagers thrown in, and there's some people doing a podcast to make you realize it's 2018. But aside from that, I mean, one thing that they did sort of make a bit more of the idea of that it was Halloween and he was just walking in and out of houses killing people randomly because it's Halloween, right? You can get away with it. But the only other scene that really I thought was effective was the scene with the kid where he's sort of thinking there's something sort of in the corner of his room, but he can't quite make out what it is. And that was actually, I was thinking, this is almost like getting back to that tension of the original. And I thought, well, maybe this movie will get better from here on, but not quite. But it was kind of just spoiled by the fact that his response was almost kind of too realistic that it killed any of the tension. He was just like, "There's a guy up there. I'm running. I'm getting out of here." And it's like, yeah, it's fair enough.
Right.
So a lot of it was kind of, it had this mismatch of, I mean, you can go through and say, what was realistic, what was not realistic, and everything else in a movie. But ultimately, you want to set them. You want the scenes to serve the mood and the feeling. And I kind of felt this was a bit kind of choppy, and it had tension sometimes, and then it got broken, and the kind of the whole thing of
the climax.
Sarah Connor trying to sort of page him and burn him is all a bit over the top, really.
That was really that was really what the main thing I felt was like kind of the biggest flaw was like, on the one hand it's dramatic and stuff, and and it worked in the sense of like kind of like, wow, like kind of this big kill, whatever, is like it's actually a trap, like kind of. But I think at the other hand though, like I said, it just felt very much like forced and kind of over the top, that like it was all set up to do that, and I can't say that like I fully saw it coming. I did feel like there was going to be something really set up. At the same time though, like kind of it just like you felt like it didn't really serve the story. It was like kind of the story served reaching that climax. It felt like kind of and I think that's when you do that, like kind of people feel that.
I mean, also you knew they weren't going to kill 3 generations of Strodes at the end of the movie, so it's, it's not like it's like a family reunion. It was more than a I didn't care for it, but it was interesting nonetheless.
And the one other thing, like I thought was like, okay, they did all that. Like I don't know, in this is like maybe like a question for you too. Is like other than the choppiness, there was a sense of that like different times. On the one hand, she had all these kind of weapons and all these kind of elaborate things and stuff like that. But meanwhile, he's breaking through the door like it's cardboard and like grabbing her and was that like meant to like kind of show that like it's was that it was to lure him in more, or I don't know. Like it seemed like pretty dangerous way to like kind of lure somebody where like you had like kind of just that kind of setup, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, I'll let you into my house and then sort of close all the doors, and then I'm going to hide in the basement. I'm going to get you to go down into the basement. I'm going to make it out of the basement, and then I'm going to trap you in there. Yeah, it was
a little Wile E. Coyote, I think.
Yeah, it was a bit. Yeah. I mean, it was. I think what it was from what I watched an interview with Jason Blum and John Carpenter, where he basically said, "Look, the studio's making this. Why don't we try and make the best of it?" And it was kind of one of those things where you kind of felt this was a bit of a, they had all the right people that should have been able to do something, because he's made Jason Blum made a lot of good horror movies.
Right.
But, you kind of felt like even with all of that and the original guy, it still didn't really do anything really interesting, unfortunately.
I think
why they made it? Money.
Yeah. That's really what it feels like, kind of. And the other thing I think connected to that is, okay, now that we've, that they've taken the things, the series there and stuff like that. So what's next, right? Do they bring Jason back, or excuse me, Michael back again? Like, like Jason, right? Where it's like a resurrection or something like that, or, where do you go from here?
Well, they've got 2 more planned. There's another one next year and one. So they're doing the movie usual story of a trilogy. I can't really. Obviously, it was reasonably successful for them to do that, but I mean, I don't hold out a huge amount of hope for those movies. But so, did you watch the Rob Zombie one though? Didn't you?
I did, and I felt like what he managed to do that was kind of different. And what's interesting is like, for the most part, it's pretty panned. Like like critics really like shot him down for like kind of overly violent, or they're like, he doesn't bring anything new. So I actually felt like what he did bring fresh to the series was more focused on Michael Myers. That like they kind of did like a lot more of the story around like kind of how did this kind of how did Michael Myers become Michael Myers and stuff. And I think that psychological focus was kind of really interesting and everything. I have to admit though that like watching the sequel to that, the H2 one, I felt like it kind of like strayed a lot away from that, and then it did get a little bit kind of just where it's more just action to violence, and it was just like kind of just seemed like almost like where, okay, we did that, but then let's just go back to like kind of the original or the old formula, if you will, and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the problem. Well, I mean, I don't know if it's a problem. They keep making money from it, but I mean, they keep trying to. There was the H2O, and then I think they did a sequel to H2O, but then they kind of just got rid of those. They said, okay, that's not canon anymore. We're going right back to this is a direct sequel to the original, but it's set 40 years later. And so, yeah, I mean, but the other thing that didn't really appeal to me in the Rob Zombie one, just from reading about it, was this idea that they actually tried to explain Michael's character a bit more. In that I think that kind of actually undermines some of the mystique of his character.
Yeah.
He just seems to be like a sort of a genetic killing machine.
Yeah.
Which I kind of prefer rather than, he had a hard childhood or something. It's kind of, yeah.
I have to admit that in some ways did kind of, destroy the mystique and that kind of, like what you had from the original, film and stuff like that. So I have to admit that like, out of all the different ones, that is like one of the things that like kind of we do unfortunately see as like kind of the thing that's had happened more and more is that they've kind of rubbed off or kind of like almost in some ways deleted a lot of the mystique by trying to explain things away or trying to like do things like kind of like the supernatural elements and all that. It's just kind of like, whereas what I have to agree that like what made the original so effective was that like we didn't really know why Michael Myers killed. Like kind of we had to sense that like it was this psycho kind of created and stuff like that. but you know, like it was just so. I think that's like kind of maybe in some ways the tension of the series that like on the one hand we want to know, but the other that like the more we reveal, you know, like kind of the less we hold back from that, then it's like kind of it wipes out like kind of you know any of the tension created from that stuff. So
Yeah.
I think that's like one of the challenges. So here's a question then. Continuing on the series and stuff, what would you like to see with the Michael Myers character? Like what to you would really like make you interested in buying like another ticket or you know getting it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? It's like there's been so many. It's like you've already gone down so many avenues. I think what I would like to see is something. I would tell you actually there were two scenes actually I really liked in the 2018 remake. The other one was the bit with the motion sensors, which I thought was actually really clever. So I mean there's definitely, you know, it's hard to reinvent something and do, you know, I can't say I can do a better job than Danny McBride and the other guys that sort of wrote that one. But I think I would like to. I think what really got to me about the original was this idea of taking, like you said, the subliminal things of everyday life and trying to, you know, find more sort of scary things with that. But to be honest with you, I haven't watched a lot of horror movies in the last 10 years. There's probably quite a few that do that quite well, and I just haven't seen them. But I mean, it's, you know, what would it be that you couldn't really have Michael Myers, you know, texting people in a terrifying way or something like this, or, you know, posting something on their Facebook feeds to freak them out. It's, you know, he's very much a kind of in your face, sort of, you know, person to person killer. So.
And at the same time, though, like what you just said, though, with the motion detectors, I mean, I think it's kind of clever to actually use, like, because one of the things we talked about before is how a lot of technology has wiped out of what, you know, would work in the past, like kind of in a horror movie or, you know, any other kind of genre movie, stuff like that. But there, in that situation, they took technology and actually, you know, made it more effective because that kind of things going in and out of the darkness, like, kind of really made things like kind of even more intense, I think. And I think that's the thing that, like, if I'd like to see anything, it'd be, you know, just being inventive, being creative with ways like kind of to use, you know, like kind of what doesn't work anymore, and then twist it into something that like kind of like, oh, okay, you know, like we didn't think of that, like kind of, you know, and so that takes effort, that takes, you know, kind of creativeness or inventiveness and stuff, and I think that that's like kind of to me would be a point to doing it, you know. So it's like, okay, you think you know, you can hide in the shadows, but you know, here's Michael Myers, like kind of, you know,
he can hide too. Yeah, I mean, I think the only problem with doing something like that is it'd be very hard to make it not a sort of heavy-handed anti-technology sort of movie. And they kind of did that with her throwing her phone, or him throwing the phone in the drink and everything else, or the pudding, whatever it was. And so yeah, it's I mean, you did wonder as well, like, why didn't anyone in that house at the end just call the police? You know, had ample about half an hour to call the police, and no one thought of doing it. But anyway, yeah, I won't try and pick holes in it too much. But yeah, difficult to say though, really. It may just be that time has moved on. The world is too connected to do that kind of killing. But I tell you what I do want to do in terms of not only what I'd see from Halloween, but what I'd like to see for us show is maybe do a version, or looking at Black Christmas and the remake of it. That might be another one, quite interesting one to do, because I think Black Christmas is the first real slasher movie apparently, and it's kind of similar. Another holiday. That was the other thing. Like, there were all these holiday themed movies about killing that all came out around about that time. And there's literally almost every one for every holiday you can think of. But.
Well, that was probably the one of the most objectionable, right? Was when they kind of you know, put a stain on Christmas, like kind of, you know, like you had all these horror movies that kind of did other holidays and stuff like that, but then when you touch Christmas, that was like kind of like, you know, whoa, like kind of, you know, that was like kind of you crossed the line there, like kind of that idea.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, like, I think art in general we do is like kind of, you know, push boundaries and stuff. I think sometimes though that, like, you know, when you push the wrong boundaries, you can really like expect to be slapped on the hand, you know, in a pretty big way, I think, and stuff. So
yeah, you could do a movie about a religious holiday and really upset people, you know.
Anyway. Let's see. Yeah, so I think that we've still got some other kind of Halloween kind of like horror slash like kind of movies that we'll be talking about, stuff like that.
Yeah,
At the
definitely.
same time, though, I'm tending towards like maybe that what might work better is like kind of like just looking at something that's more apocalyptic, because I feel like that's something that like we we've hinted at with like kind of you know, the Night of the Living Dead, and also like Halloween is not directly that way, but I feel like the connection though, as I kind of mentioned and stuff like that, was that it was being originally just pre '80s and stuff like that. It was touching on the sense of dread of like kind of something kind of something not quite right, something kind of like some kind of doom was around the corner. But I feel
Mm.
like these apocalyptic movies, they like kind of like okay, here it is, like kind of one that like kind of let's see, I'm trying to think of which ones that might be worth doing and stuff.
I could quite happily watch Escape from New York and Escape from LA again, talking post-apocalyptic, but that's just more John Carpenter. So.
Right. Those would be pretty good to do and stuff like that. Certainly, like at some point, as I mentioned, I think we'll want to do Dawn of the Dead and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think like for now, kind of like back to almost back to back zombie movies, probably a little much and stuff like that. So
Watch this space. The apocalypse is coming, I guess you could say.
one that like kind of is like still over the horizon and stuff like that, but I'm really looking forward to is Top Gun, where like kind of that'll be a fun one. That once we're like kind of it's finally here and stuff like that. That's not due out until 2020 though. So
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, Top Gun would be an interesting remake. I think they've trying to remember what else they're remaking. I'd have to start looking on IMDb, and presumably you stopped recording now.
what's that? No, I did. I'm just gonna kind of cut it out, stuff like that.
Okay.
But I guess you might as well do like a more formal, or I don't know, formal, but like a better closeout, I guess. So I guess so let's do that. So yeah, great discussion as always, and yeah, look forward to our next one about the remake and the reboots that we have coming up. We will have to see whether it'll be a horror or a more action-oriented one.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Interested in more discussions about remakes versus originals? Be sure to subscribe for our next video. Thanks for watching.